Welcome. Today we are beginning our discussion of those theistic systems of beliefs and practices. These religious systems that are also intrinsically ethical. And we can look at the different ethical treatments that are found in these religious codes. Today we're going to be turning our attention to Rabbinical Judaism, notions of Halakha, sometimes translated as the law or the way, or notions of legalism, and the value that a law code can provide to not just establishing a religion and religious practice, but also look at those ethical practices as well. So what do you think of when you hear halakha or even legalism? Most of you probably hear the term halakha and go, never heard of that before. I don't know what you're talking about. Or you might think, is that something to do with food? Thinking of probably kosher law instead and those ideas, but at least you're on the right track as kosher does develop alongside or as a result of halakha. Some of you, because of different backgrounds, probably just think of legalism as something inherently bad and something that should be avoided, or as some boring law stuff of arguing about minutia instead of really understanding the spirit of the law in there. Or still others of you might just think that it sounds important, but you're going to ignore it entirely because it's complicated probably too, and what do I do with that? For those of you who started off with this class going halakha, I have no clue. Never heard of it before. I've got no connection. I'm completely lost. The term halakha literally means the way or the path. Usually it's identified as the Jewish law code. And to understand it, we also have to understand the development of medieval Jewish philosophy. These two ideas are very intertwined and really cannot be separated. One is used to reinforce the other. There's a history to this, a history that's important to shape the development of halakha. And we have to understand a little bit of this journey because medieval Jewish philosophy and the development of halakha takes place over hundreds, if not over 1,000 years. Both begin roughly with the beginning of the Jewish Middle Ages, and the development of it takes place throughout this entire period, from 70 AD to 1806, from the destruction of the temple to the emancipation of Jews by Napoleon. So if it's all about an era change and what is taking place, it's probably good for us to conceptualize this. How do we begin different periods in your own life? What happens that you're going to say, this is now one spot to another? What marks one period of your life from another? When do you become an adult instead of a child? There's a lot of different things that you can look at that can mark this significance. Maybe it's you began puberty or graduated from high school or got a driver's license or went off to college or got married. Or maybe you're not an adult. Maybe it's when you pay your own bills in your own way. Right? Some of you might be adults at, 16. Some of you might not be adults into your late 20s, depending on how you want to define that. But we kind of need to look at what eras are taking place and what events are going to shape those, because depending on how you want to define a transition, usually there's an event or something significant that means other things are gone. Your old life is not what it was. It's something new and powerful and important that is different fundamentally because of this one transitionary thing. For Judaism, the monumental change that took place, that started this medieval era, is the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Really, to talk about Judaism before this period is more like addressing a commonality, a sort of basic idea of where a lot of groups are coming from. But when most of us are thinking about Judaism today, we're thinking of the events that are the consequence of the destruction of the temple. There were lots of different strands of Judaism in the 1st century AD. And they're all vying for control of whose voice is going to carry this legacy. But when the temple gets destroyed, many of these voices are muted, if not completely discarded. By the way, for those of you who are unfamiliar, this was the culmination of what's known as the Jewish Wars, which took place between the Romans and the Jews from 66 to 70 AD. The official result is that all Jews get exiled out of Palestine. Not all actually leave. This is just a decree. In fact, there's another uprising 50 to 60 years later, but not as significant because the temple was already destroyed and it was more just the, hey, we kind of mean it a little bit more. So what begins this period? Well, a lot of these voices go away. The Zealots were the ones who started the Jewish wars. They didn't like Rome, and they fought against Rome. And therefore, when you lose the war, those people who started it go away. We have lots of stories of the Essenes who kept talking about the battles of light versus against the battle of darkness. Right? These forces are fighting against each other. And that this massive end of the world is going to come. And we have stories of what happened at Masada and others. But the Essenes say that the forces of darkness won instead. And they lost and they're gone. They melt away. Sadducees were all about the temple rites. For them, what it meant to be Jewish meant to be engaged in temple life. Well, when the temple is gone, so is their message. Many of the Hellenizers, another strain of Judaism at this time, who tried to live in the Hellenistic world, simply abandoned some of those principles of what it meant to be Jewish or kind of faded away, and therefore they're not a voice that's going to have much importance. What we have are a group of people called the Pharisees. Pharisees literally mean separatists, and they were separating themselves from the temple life and temple authority. And one of the ways that they did this was by understanding the scripture as meaning something a little bit more, and that the laws were going to help develop this and explain this to you. So this is the voice that dominates Judaism and what becomes known as the Rabbinic period or medieval Jewry. So what begins this post-temple Judaism? How is it going to look? Well, we find that there is a forced diaspora. For those of you who don't remember, diaspora means people who live outside of their naturally linked Holy Land. And there's a lot of Jews who live outside of Canaan or Palestine or Yehud or Judea or however we'd like to, whatever term we'd like to use. At this point, estimates say that roughly for every one who lived in Judea, Yehud, the land of Canaan, Palestine, 6 lived outside of it in the broader Mediterranean world and in Persia. In fact, even the name that's being used here, that of Palestine, is used to try to take away the idea that it's your Holy Land, that it's yours. Palestine, for those of you unfamiliar with the root of that word, means the land of the Philistines. The Philistines were the boat people that got kicked out of Egypt after briefly arriving and settled in the land of Canaan, who were, by all estimates, Greek. The Romans are also, by extensions, Greek, and so when you're saying this is the land of Palestine, what the Romans are saying is not, this is our land from way back in the day for the last 1,000 years also. We got claim to it as much as you do. In fact, you're not even allowed in it. It's ours. Go. So how are you going to move forward? Well, there's one man who kind of helps lead the Jews into diaspora, as it was, through a method of study, a method of understanding the oral law, an idea that Moses came down from the mountain with not just the law, but also an oral law to help bring you into this new world. And this founder of Rabbinical Judaism. This leader is a man by the name of Rabbi Akiba ben Joseph. Akiba lived from 17 to 137. Now, for those of you who are doing some quick math, you're saying that's 120 years old. That's really old. Did he really live to be 120? And the answer is probably not. These dates are probably fudged a little way one way or the other, depending on who you are, but the 120 is very significant. Why? Well, if you're a biblical scholar, if you know the Torah, you'll be thinking real quick, who else lived to be 120 years old? Thinking and thinking and thinking, and one or two of you are shouting, I know, and the rest of you are like, I got no clue. Right? Moses lived to be 120, 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in self-exile, and another 40 years with the Exodus wandering through the wilderness before he died. For those of you unfamiliar, 40 times 3 is 120. So by saying that Akiba lived to be 120, there's some ways of equating him in some small measure with Moses. And while Moses brought the people into the land of Canaan, Akiba helps to bring you out. And he does so by adopting a new idea, or at least emphasizing an old one, that study is the highest form of worship. This is the notion that ties philosophy and law together in Jewish thought. Unlike other systems, and maybe like the Stoics, we have this idea that we want to study and we want to learn. But unlike the Stoics, where being wrong is a terrible sin, Judaism advances that it's not about the answer, but about the process. Laws end up defining the conclusions of the process, but are always things that are negotiated. You're studying not just to know, like the Stoics, but you're studying also to have the debate, and it's okay to be wrong. It's about the process. Before proceeding any further, we need to have a little pause here and imagine what would happen if you lost everything that you loved. Even those Jews who lived in Diaspora before the destruction of the temple still saw Palestine as their holy land. They still saw that as where they belonged. How would you react if you were never able to go home? What would that do to you in your own life? What if all of your possessions were lost as a result of calamities, war, strife, etc.? What if you lost all your childhood photos, toys, mementos? What would you have left? You'd likely have only a handful of things left. Hopefully, you would have your family. And your relation to your family likely would take on a greater role in your life after an event like this. And it might even be your extended family, because it helps to give you a little bit more meaning. People that were just kind of cousins or second and third cousins or distant relatives who you really didn't spend any time with before might have great significance for you now. You'll probably also have your stories, your shared history of what it is that you did. Part of the grounding of who you are would come from understanding of, hey, this is how we relate. This is what we know from, great-great-grandma and great-great-grandpa and their relations and their stories and how they got here and what they did. This would probably have more significance. You may also look up to those members of your family who hold to this history and interpret it more for you going forward, since this is what you have left, is your family and your stories. And therefore, the interpretation of how you do things, your customs, would also take on greater significance in your life. How you move forward with these things, how you live with them, become more important. And we see this with the discussion then about the fences around the Torah. The idea of how you practice, what become the customs on how you live moving forward. This is the period where we get more defined rules concerning kosher and Sabbath laws amongst everything else. There are 613 laws in Judaism. But what do they mean? How should we understand each of these laws? Becomes the customs that are built up around them. For example, a law states that you're not to shave the sides of your head. You find this in Leviticus 19:27. So where are the sides of your head? Front and the back, the whole thing? Means no mohawks or no trims, no sideburns, or yes, all right, where is this line? Is a trim okay if it says don't shave the sides of your head? Can you trim it? Can you give it a little cut? So this becomes a difference of division on how you'd like to interpret it. How broad you're going to make this fence around the Torah. How big of a circle you're going to make so you don't accidentally violate the law that's there. That's what the idea of fences around the Torah means. So some observant Jews will never cut the sides of their hair in a specific area, and that's why you get those locks that you think about. Other laws state that you shall not boil a goat in its mother's milk. You find this in Exodus 23:19. Most of us would probably agree with this as a basic sort of idea, right? That it would be cruel and somehow inhumane to kill the offspring of a goat and then cook it in the milk that was there to nourish that goat. Like, we kind of look at that and goes, yeah, that's kind of a little creepy. And it wouldn't matter if it's a goat or a calf or anything else, right? It doesn't matter the mammal. Like, that idea of killing the offspring and using what was supposed to nourish them to cook it in is too much. So it would also probably not be okay to make cheese out of that milk and put cheese on top of it for that same reason, or to mix that all in your stomach, right? So you wouldn't even have it in the same meal, or some people wouldn't even have them served on the same dishes or the same plates, or if possible, you'd have two kitchens and you create a dairy kitchen and a meat kitchen. And different elaborate rules of kosher dietary restrictions grow out of verses like this. Even if they're not related, right? You can be pretty sure that your cheese that you get are from dairy cows, usually done at large production farms, as well as your meat, and these are not related animals at all, yet still for many Jews they're going to be kept separate, or even of the same species. You're not going to have goat cheese on a beef burger, right? The prohibition will extend to keep these things separate. Other questions also arise, like remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. This is one of the big ones. It's right number 4 of the 10 Commandments. It's up there, right? It's a very important one. But what does it mean to remember a day or to keep it holy? Ideally, the easiest way to do this is to not make it ordinary, not make it profane. In other words, don't do any work. But then, what's work? Let's say it's the Sabbath and you live on a 5th story of an apartment. Do you go up the stairs or do you take the elevator? Which one do you do? Well, which one's work? Pushing a button is somebody's job. By the way, it also uses electricity and everything else, right? So that is work. You take the stairs. Now, not everyone does all these things. Not everyone's fence is as big as what these are. And different Jews will be more or less observant, and their fence will be bigger or smaller depending on their personal convictions and their friends that they have and their convictions, and the circle that you exist, and what era and what location. So where is it we're supposed to get these laws from, the Torah, that we're supposed to have this fence around and build? The chief place it comes from is the Talmud. The Talmud is viewed in some parts as the oral Torah that is written down. It's the belief that Moses came down from the mountain with the Torah written down, but also a special oral Torah that was given really for the priests. Not a universal idea, by the way, at the time. This is held more by the majority of your Pharisaic groups, but not even all of them, and not held by groups like you're going to see amongst the Sadducees and others.
The Talmud's job was to help explain the laws and provide the basis of making decisions. So in many ways, the oral Torah is a commentary on that original one, and then you have other parts such as Midrash and further commentaries and stories. As you're taking a quick glance here at the different pages of Talmud, while you have some that are stylistic and beautiful with the art all around it, the majority of it that you will find usually has got different concentric circles of text. One thing that you'll also find with these concentric circles is those outside ones are usually different in how they're arranged and structured. And this is going back to that idea too that, right, it's about study. If you look at those outside rings and you could actually read them, you'll see that oftentimes there's different applications or arguments over how to interpret that text in the middle. You'll have one school of thought saying one thing, and you'll have another school of thought saying another, and yet both of them are on that page addressing that same story. This isn't hidden from you because study is the highest form of worship, not certainty. And so this is the way to go about that. Throughout the Talmud and other texts, we're going to have a discussion on the 613 laws that God has given. Right? There's not just the 10 on those tablets, but a much wider basis for Halakha. These laws include the written law as well as the oral law, the ordinances and customs and decrees that were enacted from the time of Moses until the completion of the Talmud in their two forms, the Babylonian 500 AD and the Hebrew or Palestinian 400 AD. By the way, the Babylonian, one of those, was seen as more authoritative. It helps define what's a mitzvah. Right, the explanation of the Torah, also known as the commandments or duties, but it's also a blessing. Sometimes you might even hear somebody say, oh, it would be a mitzvah if this happened. It would be a blessing if this thing happened. And yet the laws and commandments are this blessing also. It's a blessing that God has given you what to do and what not to do. It's not just a commandment to make sure you follow one thing or another, but it's to help you thrive in life. There are different laws, halakhot, that are applied in different mitzvahs as well. There are 248 of which that are positive commandments. This is an allusion to the number of limbs in the human body or bones that exist in the human body. Roughly how this was identified as its own sort of set of math and everything. And then there's also 365 negative commandments or prohibitions, which is either an allusion originally to the number of days in a solar year, or others have pointed out the number of tendons also by a different form of calculation that you would have in your body. Those things that are you don't want to break, right? Because it's too much, or one to kind of remind yourself daily what you ought not to do. But there's 613 laws that govern what you're supposed to do in your life. The group of people that help you understand these were the Gaons. The Gaon are the leaders of the academies. There's two major academies at this time that's being addressed, both around Baghdad, one in Sura and one in Pumbedita. Gaon means excellency or worthy, and these were the people that were worthy enough because they were wise to help you understand what you ought to do and how you ought to live and connect your life to these halakha, to the laws, to the halakhot, the individual laws as they're applied. And the Gaon's major job was to issue what's known as responsa, give you answers on these major questions that you have in your life. You might wonder if it's okay to do something or not to do something, or where this should go. I was told by a former professor of mine that the big question that was existing in his synagogue at the time was whether or not it was okay to eat bakos. Bakos. For those of you unfamiliar with this, you usually probably encounter them in a salad bar, although some of you might have a bottle or so at home. They are made out of soy protein. They're not meat. They're smoke flavored and often identified as fake bacon chips. So is it okay to have them? If bacon is not allowed, is it okay to have an imitation bacon? So you might write one Gaon and the Gaon of Surah, and you're waiting. Okay, is it okay for me to Bekos? You don't get back to him, so you write the Gaon of Pumbedita, and the Gaon of Surah says, absolutely not. It's forbidden to have pork. Why would you want to have anything that's imitation of pork? You're only opening the door for, temptation. Avoid this at all costs, even though it's imitation. Why would you want imitation evil? It's evil in itself. Go away. Maybe. And then the next day, you got your letter back from the Surah Pumbedita, and what does he say? Well, it's fine. Not made out of pork. No pork's in it. If you want to have, indulge yourself in artificial things, go ahead. By the way, you'll even notice that little U with the circle around it on that, container of Bekos means it's kosher, all right? Because it doesn't have anything. Whether or not you should have it becomes its own large debate, but this becomes a sort of question. And even over things that we might see as trivial become important of how big of a fence do you put around the Torah? How do you look at things moving forward?
The undisputed greatest of the Gaons was the Gaon Saja ben Joseph. He was the Gaon of Surah. He lived from 892 to 942 and would become the Gaon of Surah in 928. Again, likely he is the greatest of the Gaons who ever lived. He was born in Fawn, which is in Egypt, in 892, and at the age of 20 he did something that no one else has ever done before him. He produced a Hebrew dictionary. Now, a dictionary, we say, okay, well, that's nice, nobody's done that before, and there's value. He wasn't the first one to ever make any dictionaries. But doing so in Hebrew was important because the Hebrew people, from the time of the Diaspora, or those speaking, or the Jews, or however term we'd like to use, had lived all over the Mediterranean world, in and around Baghdad, and everywhere else. And largely their languages were being absorbed into Arabic and Arabic practices, including admiring Arabic poetry. And this dictionary included a rhyming dictionary and a lexicon to let you know what the words meant. The rhyming dictionary is actually what had the greatest significance because it allowed for the further development of Hebrew poetry. As you all know or will become aware of, every culture has their different forms of poetry. Some, it's rhyme and meter. Right? That generally is speaking, the idea of what it is for English poetry. Many of you learned haiku, a portion of Japanese linked verse, that it's not about rhyme or meter, but it's about counting syllables. And the wider discussion about linked verse, it is even more than that. Arabic poetry has a flow, and it doesn't have artificial breaks. This is what makes it admired. And Jewish poetry, Hebrew poetry, didn't have any of that. It was saying something and then saying it again slightly differently. It's something many of you are probably familiar with if you read Psalms and Proverbs or other sections of Hebrew scripture where it says something to the effect of, there were 6 of them, yes, even 7. And from the modern 21st century perspective, you're probably asking yourself, well, is there 6 of them or 7? And the answer is that's not the point. The point is that it's a poem. We're going to say something and we're going to say it again slightly differently. And this wasn't as popular as the Arabic poetry. And surrounded by Arabic poetry, the Jews started just doing it. And Saja says, no, we can steal the form, but we'll use Hebrew. And it allows for the further development of Hebrew culture. Outside of the Hebrew scriptures, too, Saja was the first one to write a prayer book. This is the first Jewish prayer book and treats prayer systematically. It's got educational concerns and pedagogical concerns. When should you pray, what prayers at what time and which way, or over what needs, and yet prayer goes beyond just a legal system. He also wrote the Tafsir, which is the Arabic translation of the Hebrew scriptures. Septuagint was the first major translation of scripture into another language. This was from Hebrew into Greek and was done by 70 scribes. Saja did it himself. Different sort of thing. And by the way, it's still seen as good that it is still the standard Arabic Bible. And he treated language in a scientific
method, in a scientific way. He would also write on other issues of law and poetry, both secular and religious, and he also helped to develop the Jewish calendar. This actually is one of the more controversial things, according to some, because you'll get all sorts of divisions on was Saja right in his development of the calendar and why. Well, there was still a debate amongst wide swaths of Jews during this period of when is it that the New Year should be celebrated? Should it be done in the spring or in the fall? And it's one of the major holidays, but isn't always being done because there's debate on when it should be. Saja will say that the New Year is with the commemoration of the birth of mankind, 10 days before Yom Kippur, the highest of the holidays, and therefore this is the beginning and the fixing of the year. And largely this is accepted, except for Karaites and other groups to whom would disagree with Saja and his notion of the calendar. Saja's understanding of Halakha and philosophy is found in his work called the Books of Beliefs and Opinions. This is his main sort of philosophical text. And he says that there's a direct tie with religion and philosophy, that these overlap, right? This is why it is the religious law as well as a philosophical text. He'll take doctrines or laws out of the Jewish tradition and try to apply philosophy to them. And his goal was to try to make halakha a rational belief instead of just a dogmatic one. And so one of the things that he does in this work is he looks at our sources of knowledge. And he says that there are 4 of them. The first is sense perception. And while many of us today might think of this as highly valuable and probably the most obvious and most important of our sources of knowledge, Saja actually says that it's fairly low. Why? Because our senses lie to us. We think we see things or hear things all the time. I mean, how many of you have ever walked down the street and you see somebody you know and you wave to them only to realize that's not them? In fact, might even not look anything like them, and your senses were wrong, right? Or you think you are smelling something cooking in another room and you go in there and nope, wrong food, wrong thing, or any other sorts of things. All of your senses lie to you all the time. And therefore, this is not the best source of our knowledge. Studies have even been done actually about putting red dye into white wine, and you'll get connoisseurs of wine describing that white wine as if it's a red because their eyes told them it's red and their taste buds are then even lying to them, right? All of our senses lie to us all the time. And therefore, it's not something that really should be trusted first and foremost. Next, and really what we should use a little more often than our sense perception, are those first principles of reason that are given by intuition. In other words, we're all built in with a certain set of a priori knowledge, that we have certain knowledge about the world as it starts off in ourselves before moving forward. Now, this puts him in a wider debate within the realm of philosophy and would side him along the sides with Descartes as opposed to those of Hume, although those both come much later than he is. And this is because in many ways Saja is a Neoplatonist. After this, he says that we should have the results of valid deductive inference, that we should be able to deduce some things given by our intuition and know whether or not things are true or not. And finally, and as equal as inference and a priori knowledge and reason, is reliable tradition. This is not simply used as an apologist for Judaism, but finding reliable sources becomes the basis of decisions. Which ideas can be addressed and where it comes about, and really is the beginning of philosophy. Using tradition, we get to gather the knowledge of generations before us. We get to know what things are true because they've proven themselves true over and over again. Other people throughout our religious or social traditions have said there's value here, and that is what helps us move forward. What Saja is pushing for is a union between reason and tradition. Many of the laws that we find within religious traditions we could probably agree with and might even come to our own using just reason. But likely on some of these we'd probably make mistakes. We'd take a little longer to get there, or we wouldn't really understand why they're there until they're actually there. Right? You have to have these things to give you an understanding of it. So we need to accept that tradition has given us an answer to many of our questions before we even ask them. Right? If you watch Fiddler on a Roof and those opening clips of it, right, you see that tradition helps also keep your balance in a world that's dangerous, in a world that's falling apart, that doesn't really help you out. It gives us the laws that we need to follow. Tradition is a part of Halakha as it helps us understand Halakha as well. If you're wanting another example, instead of watching a movie, if you prefer to read a book, I'd highly recommend James Coogle's work on being a Jew. This was one of my instructors, former instructor, and it's kind of a novelization of a young Jew wanting to figure out if he should marry somebody who's not Jewish. And he goes and he talks to a rabbi before making this decision, and a whole discussion takes place and dialogue over a period of time, and his outlooks and attitudes change towards it. And it's a great way of understanding the value of tradition without actually inventing it, right, or anything else to that effect. But we also have other traditions in our life other than just religious traditions. Many of you have family traditions. And you can stop here and even reflect about what some of those are. What are the things that you do with your family? What are the ramifications of those? Most of your family traditions help ground you and connect you to your family. You know who you are because of these traditions. You always do this at this time. Well, what happens if you don't do that? Well, your understanding of what it is to be a part of that family kinds to feel shaky, feels off. You don't know if you should do any of these other things as a result. So traditions give you a sense of connectedness and belonging, and it helps to order your world even when you don't think that it needs ordering, even when you think it might just all be rational or exist in some other way. Tradition helps you understand how you need to move forward and proceed with your life. The greatest of the Sephardic Jews is a man known as Moses Maimonides, also sometimes referred to as the Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. And it is said, from Moses to Moses, there are none like him. He really lives during the zenith of medieval Jewish life and is the most comprehensive mind of medieval Jewry. He develops a complete system of Judaism, and it embraces all of Jewish literature, science, philosophy, and medicine. In many ways, he is kind of the epitome of these. He'll also issue a response to dealing with the own controversies of his day. In many ways, we kind of see him as a Gaon, just without an academy, because of his prolific import. His works include the 10 treatises on medicine, all of which, by the way, were written in Arabic, and there's no mention of God in them at all. But he does use a lot of philosophy in talking about the value of snake bites, and venom from poisonous snakes is an example of Aristotle's golden mean, that a little bit of poison sometimes is used to cure people of illnesses, while a lot of it will kill you. Addresses issues of diet and medicine and psychological issues, and tries to address the cause of diseases, including one possible cause of diabetes, and also talks about sexual practices, aphrodisiacs, which included chopped onions in that list, and the value of physical exercise. He has a commentary on the Mishnah that he wrote while in Spain in 1158. He was only 23 years old. and ends up writing about the oral law at this point. During this time, he knew the Talmud well enough to just use his memory, and he'll end up completing it much later in 1168 when he is in Egypt after lots of craziness has happened in his own life. He is the first one to have a successful, mostly adopted, article or creed that Jews can hold on to of what it means to be Jewish as opposed to not. He has 13 articles that he lays out and says, okay, this is what's going to define what it is to be Jewish. And it includes issues of excommunication and longer things and addressing who God is. And really after this, most of the Jewish people throughout the Mediterranean world, etc., are kind of divided between those who agree with Maimonides, known as Maimonists, and those who disagree, or anti-Maimonists. He'll write the Mishnah Torah, also known as the Yad Hazaka, or the Strong Hand, in 1180. It completes the second great of his legal works, and it's the only work that he wrote in Hebrew. In it, he addresses laws on the relations of God and man, individual and civil and criminal law. Sacrifices also, he says, should only be offered in the temple when the Jews hold Palestine. He says this in large ways because he believes that it was never going to actually happen, so it's a great way of avoiding that issue in its entirety. And to his greatest philosophy work outside of this, the one that has the largest impact into medieval philosophy outside of just Jewish circles immediately, is the work The Guide for the Perplexed, which he wrote in 1195. This was translated by the family of Ibn Tibbon in the area of the land between Spain and France, and is very important for later scholastic thinkers like Aquinas, amongst others, and being able to help translate some of these ideas of Aristotle. Here, very important for philosophy, but the point is also to subordinate philosophy to the ideas of revealed religion. And he was firmly convinced of the truth of Aristotle and the truth of Judaism, believing that these two things can work hand in hand. The Guide for the Perplexed helps you understand your firm religious beliefs by using philosophy, and it was an apologetic work. Now, as we read in the Mishnah Torah on human dispositions, we should probably start off with asking a fairly simple question. Is everyone the same? Not are we all equal of having rights or anything like that, but are your dispositions the same? Are the things that you like the same as everyone else around you? Most of you at this point are probably screaming, no, we're not, right? That we are not. There's different tendencies that you have than what I have, different things that interest you than will interest me, different talents that you have and different ones that I will have. And this is the starting point of the work. Maimonides points out that there is in one man a feverish temperament, constantly vexed, and there is another man of calm disposition without angry moods whatsoever. That one man is sensual and another is pure-hearted, that one is greedy and another is restrained. One suffers hunger in his effort of hoarding and does not eat a cent's worth without causing him great torture to himself, and another wastes his money at his own hand deliberately. And as such ways are all the rest of these tendencies. As the optimist versus the pessimist, the miser and the philanthropist, the cruel and the merciful, the coward and the stout-hearted. And there are between each and every one of these extreme tendencies of an opposite vein mean tendencies, one distinct from another. The two extremes in every tendency is not a good way. Right? We don't want somebody who's a complete pushover, nor do we want somebody who's so pig-headed to not give an inch. Right? There needs to be some moderation within these human dispositions. Just like Aristotle said, these extremes we would call vices, and in the middle is where virtue would be found. He says it's not proper for a man to follow these extremes, nor to have himself instructed in them. If one finds his nature leaning towards them, or susceptible to one of them, or if he already acquired one of them and followed it, he should turn himself towards goodness by following the path of the good, which is the straight. Right? This straight path that he's calling for, remember what halakha means. Halakha literally means the way or the path, and therefore this path that leads you to straight living, this straight path is halakha. The straight path is the mean disposition found in each and every one of these tendencies of all of the human tendencies, according to Maimonides. He should not be an excitable person, easily angered, nor like the dead without feelings, but adopt this middle course, right? This should very much remind you of Aristotle, right? The goal is to temper our extremes, and therefore we need to look at all of these different tendencies that we have and understand that to have a good life where we're not getting destroyed by one extreme or another, we need to know what this path is and how we got it. So how do we do this? He says that we need to be devout, and that this is actually the middle path. He says one who controls himself with increased restrictions and distances himself even from the mean tendency, a little one way or a little one way, is called devout, right? If you want to stay in this mean tendency, right, you want to stay down this middle path, we would call you devout. How may you do it? One who will distance himself from extreme point of arrogance will become exceedingly humble. This is called devout, for the tendency of piety. If one distances himself by the mean point only and practices meekness, he is called a wise man, for this is the tendency of wisdom. A like pathway exists in all of our other tendencies. All of the tendencies that any of us might have, there is a way which is above all of these others. This is the way of being devout, of being wise, of being pious. It is because the Creator has termed these attributes, he says, which are the middle way. This is called the Lord's way. God's way is the middle way, and the law then gives us this proper balance. The advantage, according to Halakha, is that God has already told you what you should avoid and what you should venture towards. And so, do what God has already instructed. He's laid out what this is. You don't need to practice by having a little bit too much vice one way and another way, right? Tradition and God, through that tradition, has already given you the appropriate path and the appropriate understanding. So God and tradition has already laid out what this moderate path is of what we should live, and which ways can help you flourish and have the best possible life. And yet, many of you have a knee-jerk reaction against what Maimonides is saying. You're saying, no, let me figure it out on my own. I don't need the tradition to tell me what's good. I don't need you to say it's religious revelation that's good. I'm going to reject that. And then I'm going to say I'm going to even want things that are a little bit bad. I don't need to be so pure-hearted and devout. I want to do a little bit of, what feels good at the moment. So why is it that you do what's bad for you? Why is it that you want what's bad? Maimonides turns his attention to this question in chapter 2. Asking you things like, why are you involved in relationships that you know aren't going to help you to prosper? Why is it some of you abuse your bodies with chemical excess? Why do you spend as much time as you do on social media? Does it actually make you feel happy, connected, or fulfilled? Probably not. And many of you can kind of look at one of these areas and go, yeah, that's one I screwed up on. I was good on those, but not that one, right? And we got this little well, why is it you do that? Why is it you are engaged in one of these areas of activities that are bad, that at the end of it, you're not happy. You're not more connected with other people, and you're not fulfilled as a human being. Well, why would you do any of this? Maimonides answers, to the physically sick, the bitter tastes sweet, and the sweet bitter. Of among the sick, there may be one who craves and desires food, which is unfit for consumption, for instance, dirt and coal, and despises good food such as bread and meat according to the seriousness of the disease. Even so are people whose souls are sick. They desire and love the evil tendencies and hate the good way and are lazy to follow it, for it becomes a very heavy load upon them in proportion to their ailment. Why is it you want bad things? Because you're sick. Because you are not right. Your soul is sick. Some of you with the why is it you do these other things were answering because it seemed like fun. It seemed like a good idea at the time. It seemed like something that was going to benefit me, even though I probably knew it wasn't going to. Well, why? Because you're sick. And therefore you're desiring to eat dirt instead of bread. So this is a problem that Maimonides points out that we need to be aware of. And yet, the solution is not just what Aristotle would say of moderation in all things, right? This is not just a different version of Aristotle or Buddhism, of trying to say a middle way, once again. There's times that we cannot be moderate, but we must be extreme. And being moderate is what's going to get you sick. Most of you would already agree there's some things that you can't be a little moderate with. Methamphetamine is not something you play around with. Oh, I'm just a little moderate meth use. No, right? A little bit of that is bad and you need to run away. And yet, there's other things that you need to be extreme with, right? Certain things you need to have zero and certain things that you need to have a lot. Yet he says there are certain tendencies which man is forbidden to follow in the middle way, but must distance himself from extreme to extreme. The good way is not merely that man is meek, but he should be humble-spirited. Then his spirit will be extremely lowly. This is the reason why it is said of Moses that he was very meek, Numbers 12:3, and not merely meek, but the most meek man who had ever lived. That he didn't have any flattery in languages or say, oh, look at how great I am, but stayed humble throughout all this. And this is what we are to do, which is an extreme thing to say, I'm going to be humble, or I'm going to avoid doing certain things that I know will destroy me. And you know already that there's times that you must be extreme in your life. While you might not agree with being meek as an extreme example, most of you know that you need to be extreme in some circumstances. When you see abuse, as was happening with Penn State and Michigan State and the sexual abuse of U.S. gymnastics and so many other issues along those ways, if you saw any of these things, you wouldn't just go, well, I need to be moderate with this. I need to, listen to all sides and not weigh in. And no, you would say there's absolutely a horrible bit of abuse that's happening to innocent children, usually. And therefore, you need to stand up regardless of what it's going to cost you. You know that you have certain moral convictions that regardless of what's happening around you, you need to stand up and say, this is not okay. But that you need to be extreme. You also know there's other times in your life that things might look bad, but it's really none of your business. Obviously, what we saw in Penn State, Michigan State, etc. is not one of those mind your own business moments, right? You know that there are times where somebody else is having an altercation between themselves and it's not really your business to get into. And there's other times when somebody is being abused and it's incumbent upon you to do that, right? That there's not just a simple one size fits all of, moderation in all things, right? That you need to be extreme. That these are times when you're called to stand up. So when is it you should be extreme and when you shouldn't? Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah Daily Offerings and Additional Offerings points out that there is a tradition that dictates when and how things are done. Sometimes traditions that don't seem to make any sense on their own, but will help you arrive at the conclusions that you need to go with. Right? Remember that discussion about counting 3 times before the harvesting, or counting sheep. You thought, well, why is this being done? Why is it you're repeating things 3 times just to make sure that you're right? Well, the tradition says to do that. Why? Well, probably for some reason that you'd figure out after you do it. Or that people who confirm something 3 times get it right, as opposed to not. Remember, there's value in this tradition, going back to even what Saja was saying, right? Those ideas of how we understand the world, not just sense perception, not just principles of reason or deductive inference, but tradition, and a reliable tradition that you know has been safeguarded, is going to help you not make these mistakes. This is why we have further discussions about how we should organize and arrange our lives. This is how we get to understand the difference between how we're going to approach religiously legal matters as opposed to speculations, right? The difference between Halacha and Nagadata. This is, in your reading, that discussion of who owns the cloak, right? 2 men are holding a cloak and come before a judge. He says, this one says, I found it, and the other says, I found it. If this one says it's all mine and the other one says it's all mine, then one must swear that he does not own less than half, and the other must swear that he does not own less than half, and therefore they divide it. Dividing means each gets half, because now they've both honestly said, I don't own less than half, and you both get half. Though if one man says this is all mine and the other one says this is half mine, because he believes that they discovered it simultaneously, the one who says it's all mine must swear that he does not own less than 3/4, and the one who says half of it is mine must swear that he does not own less than 1/4. And of this one he takes 3/4, and of that one he takes 1/4. Justice has been done. You believe that it's not entirely yours? Fair. He believes that it is all his. He gets more than you, because what you're arguing over then is that second half, and we're going to split that. Right? For one thing, since each party concedes that he only found a cloak but never purchased it, what about the man whom the cloak originally belonged to? Shouldn't it be returned to him? Might be a question you were asking. But we must assume, therefore, that the cloak neither had been abandoned or that efforts had already found the owner and proved futile. Secondly, he says it's no coincidence that the Mishnah portrays both parties coming to court holding the cloak. As a rule, there's this idea of possession as 9/10 of the law that goes back, right? Both men come in holding this, already having a claim on it. But what is it that the claim is to? That becomes part of the discussion, right? Tradition is going to help you where inference and reason and sense perception can't. Third, he says, why the need for an oath at all? Why not just divide the cloak? The purpose of the oath is to induce fear in the liar, to discourage him from persevering in his dishonesty. If somebody knows that they're lying, you make them swear, you make them attest to what is true, and if they can't do that, then they're going to go away and justice would be served this other way, right? So you're going to make them swear this. Fourth, why do the rabbis impose so strange an oath? Since each one claims that it is all mine, why not have each one swear that the entire cloak belongs to them? This is another valid question you might ask. It says, were each party to swear to owning the entire garment, the court knowingly would be administering a false oath. 2 people would be swearing to full ownership of one garment, yet were each party to swear that he owns only half of the garment, he would be discrediting his earlier claim that he owns it all. And so you can't make somebody claim something that's the disputed issue. So you discuss what it means beyond that. The strange wording of the oath and why you give one litigant 3/4 of the garment's value and the other is only 1/4 is another question you might ask. He says, the person who claims that he owns only half admits that the other half of the garment belongs to the first person, and the dispute is really therefore restricted only to this remaining half. That half, the court in turn divides in half, so that way one party gets 3/4 and the other gets 1/4, right? You have tradition that's been used to fulfill the question of how is it you should look at these weird disputes. Everyone gets to keep their honesty and integrity. Tradition has let that happen. You have a reliable count on the sheep or coming in of the harvest or whatever, right? You have different ways that tradition helps you navigate the craziness of life. Maimonides further addresses the issue of Halakha and other works as well, and tries to understand the relationship that words have in this tradition and the import that they do. He points out a story that is a dispute between two rabbis, Eleazar and Joshua. And Joshua, he says, keeps saying that he is right, and if so, X will listen to him. Rivers get turned back, the walls are bent, trees are moved, etc. Then Rabbi Eleazar says to the sages, if the Halakha is according to me, may a proof come from heaven. Then a heavenly voice went forth and said, what do you have to do with it, Rabbi Eleazar? The Halakha is according to him in every place. Then Joshua rose up to his feet and said, it is not in the heavens, as Deuteronomy 30:12 says. What did he mean by quoting this? Rabbi Jeremiah says, he meant that since the Torah has been given already on Mount Sinai, we do not pay attention to a heavenly voice, for you have written in your Torah, decide according to the majority, Exodus 23:2. What does this mean? We're not going to wait and listen for a new revelation. Halakha isn't calling out for heaven. It's also using your reason. Tradition tells you that majority can decide about things. But people can have a vote and can ask where you get these ideas. To look around here on the earth for signs and symbols. To use your senses, intuition, and deduction. These things are not removed from the discussion of tradition. That you still are going to hold on to it. Therefore, the Torah and the Halakha are not found out in heaven because they've already been delivered. They're already here on earth. And you need to learn it and study it. And that's what's going to help you move forward in this life. Still, there are questions between what things mean. And he addresses this in another work on the issues of Peshat and Midrash Halakha. Right, there's a distinction between the plain meaning, that of Peshat, and a text and the Midrash, or the commentaries around it, like the one we just had, that you might be a little confused about what it means, because what is that plain meaning, right? He says that we need to examine a more complicated issue, this relationship between Peshat and Midrash Halakha, which is to say between the simple reading of a text and the readings of classical works, which mind the biblical verses for their practical significance in Halakha. He says, despite these interpretations, this verse cannot be stripped of its plain meaning. As it is written, God spoke one utterance, yet two things have I heard. The verse supports both interpretations, right? That sometimes there is a second significance, that there's not just the plain meaning, but there might be some significance when a verse says something of how it would be applied in another context. You might encounter part of what the tradition is addressed in one area and say, well, that also seems to apply this year in my life in this way. Therefore, it's okay to draw that out and therefore have significance in how you're supposed to address your current life moving forward. Because, you know, sometimes words might have more than one meaning. So it's really important that we interpret it right, that we have some sort of grounds to help us understand what a text means and how we are supposed to address it moving forward. It says we group rules and regulations together and interpret them accordingly. We all know that if a rule applies to one thing, the analogous item should also be similar. Therefore, the law, which was written in one context, should be applied to the next. That many things are all identical in the manner in which they are performed and have the same objective. Right? So are you doing it the same way? Does it have the same objective? And therefore you can apply these things. He says the various examples need only to be assumed, and the law would apply to that new case like it did to the old. But if you're trying to do the same thing in just a different sort of way, that same law that would have applied in a different case should be applied in this one. You're trying to have the same results, the same basic proceedings should help get you there. And here he lists out a long list of mitzvot according to the halachot of the Mishnah Torah. If we are just going to, for the sake of time, look at some of these issues for personal development, we could ask ourselves, why should we do any of these things? And what is the benefit? Why not break them? How would your life be better served if you obeyed these or were worse? Right? He says that these halachot, the laws of personal development, contain 11 mitzvot, laws about these things, right? 5 positive and 6 negative commandments. You are to emulate his ways, God's ways, to cling to those who know God, to love your fellow co-religionists, to love those converts, right? Not to look down upon somebody who's different because they came in later. They don't have the same ancestry, right? Not to hate your own brethren, to rebuke. Right? There's times that you need to rebuke things. Right? You're wrong. I need to say this, but again, keeping that in there where you're not hating and you're loving. Right? This kind of tied in with this. Not to embarrass, not to oppress the unfortunate, not to gossip or to take vengeance or to bear a grudge. Right? Here we have a long list of things that you should do, and your life is probably to be benefited if you did them. At least, within your own particular religious and social context. Do what's good and emulate those who do good. Becomes part of this tradition. Laying out rules of how you should follow these things and those things. Tradition has the laws, and then the laws help you understand the value of that tradition. So what has this religious system told us about what's ethical? It isn't just about, here's what God says, follow it. While the idea of God is absolutely essential to the notion of halakha towards this law, it's really concerned about ethical practices. It's about giving you the basis of understanding how to address dilemmas that you have today. So what dilemmas do you have today, and which ones can notions of halakha help you address? How does it help enumerate what would be a good life for you? Or what are the passions in your life? Right? If halakha is the way or the path, it's this straight path, it's this straight road, aren't the passions the extremes on one side or the other? So you might have thought you were good in some areas and realized, maybe not in this one. Maybe it's my passional nature that's driving me one way or the other. How about different ways of overcoming the passions? What does that look like? Or again, that question about why you should overcome the passions. In other words, how does succumbing to the passions reduce that meaningfulness of life? And while most of us would say that this coming from Judaism is a religious system, what qualities of an ethical system does it contain? How is it notably different, if you believe it is, to Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism, or Buddhism? Do one of those lack a quality that this has? Or is it just the idea that these ideas come from God? Is that the notion that trumps everything? Does it lack any specifics? Or is this, while also a religious system, essentially a traditional ethical system? Ultimately, you should be asking how this system can help you address some of the big questions today. We all have different struggles surrounding us. How is it going to help you with those debates? Does it address any of it? Or are you kind of left alone? Remember, Maimonides said that if a rule applies to one thing, the analogous item should be similar. That we can group rules and regulations together and interpret them accordingly. So if you have questions like men's rights or women's rights or economic status or age status or racial issues or war or life issues, including euthanasia, abortion, capital punishment, all of those standard ethical questions that we have, how would this address those? How would the system tell you how you should conduct yourself economically? Where you should buy your goods from? Which businesses you should do business with? Which businesses you should avoid? While this is a religious system, it's clearly analogous to these ethical concerns as well. And none of these happen to say, or else you're going to go to hell. Right? That wasn't the hanging over you, the issues of damnation or God's not going to be happy with you. This was all still directed towards you having a good and ethical life, and understanding the ground or the basis for morality is somewhere deeper than just your whims at the moment or which sophistry you'd like to follow. So stop and reflect on how it can help you address those big questions that we have today.